When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Greasecom YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be doing part 2 of our Dance with Dragons retrospective. I'm glad you guys seem to enjoy the first part. It did way better so far than A Feast for Crows, which isn't that surprising given that I think most people's least favorite book is A Feast for Crows, which is unfortunate, even though it is mine as well. Not to be a hypocrite, but it is mine as well. But I will say I actually made a little bit of an oopsie that I don't think anyone pointed out in the first video, so I'm glad people didn't notice. But I actually forgot to do Theon 1 in the first part. I was going through my notes and I was looking through, I'm like, wait a minute, I don't seem to have the number of chapters that it says I'm supposed to have. And so I went back and I actually missed Theon 1 or Reek 1. It's supposed to be right in between the Bran 2 chapter that we ended the last part on and the Dany 2 chapter. So I'm going to start with that chapter, even though we are a little bit out of order once again, but we'll get back on track. But before we do get into the video, thank you for my Patreons and members for supporting this channel. If you did want to become one, you do get videos early, and also you will be getting exclusive content in the summer. So let's get into the video and let's talk about part 2 of A Dance with Dragons retrospective. So, given that we're starting with Theon 1, this is going to be a really interesting chapter because you have to remember, we haven't seen Theon for 2 books, right? The last we see of him is at the end of A Clash of Kings. And so there's no information about Theon in book 3. There's no information about Theon in book 4. There's alluding to that he's dead or he's just not anywhere to be seen. And so when you come back to this character, and again, we don't know it's Theon, right? It's just Reek. Who is this character of Reek? And maybe if you were a very detailed reader and you remembered, you would have remembered that Reek was a character that we learned a little bit earlier on in book 2 and or book 3. So you might be thinking already, okay, this is related to Ramsay. So, okay, well, who is this character then? And we see that this character is basically a husk of himself. He's starving to death. He's desperate, looking for a rat. He's living in complete fear. And we as the character with Big Walder and Little Walder find this character and realize that this is Theon Greyjoy, a character that has lost fingers. His hair is turning gray. He looks visibly aged, even though it hasn't been that long. He looks like an old man at this time as he's malnourished. It's a horrifying thought. And this chapter really is not like a big plot chapter in terms of what actually happens, but it's a huge revelation because us, the audience, you know, especially looking at the last book where it kind of really develops into that Greyjoy plot line, it kind of has in the back of your mind what happened to Theon. Well, this is what happened. And so as a reader, you're going to be very conflicted in this book about how you feel about Theon. Theon is a character that I think a lot of people do not like in the first 2 books. And when you come back to him here, you're sitting here going, I can't help but feel bad for him. Nobody should have to endure what Theon, you know, dealt with. Maybe Theon deserves to be killed for his actions, betraying the Starks, whatnot. But at the same time, does he deserve to be tortured and all of these things? It's an interesting little way that George plays with it. It's something I think it's very interesting with Cersei as well, where he takes a character we really don't like and puts them through the ringer to gain them sympathy, and we can understand that character. It makes us question our feelings on a particular plotline or character. And so Theon, during this time, really what mainly the focus is he is going to have to do this mission of helping freeing up the North from the Ironborn at Mokalan. We'll get into that at the end of this video as his next chapter's kind of towards the end of this retrospective, or this second part of the retrospective, but I did want to come back and make sure we did do that because it's a vital part of this chapter. It's a vital part of this book, and it's one of the best plot lines, and so I apologize for missing that in the last video if any of you guys did wonder that. So that gets us back on track. So we're back on with chapter 15. And Tyrion 4 to me is, of the first 4 chapters we get of Tyrion, it's the best one of the first 4. And something else I want to point out as we're going into this chapter, you got to remember, we're only 15 chapters in. That would point to the idea that over a quarter of the chapters so far have been Tyrion chapters. Again, it's George taking what people had on complaints about Feast for Crows and giving them it here, right? Giving us the main characters, front loading them quite a lot in this book. But in this chapter, we are introduced into some very interesting characters, notably Septa Lemore and young Griff. We still see how Tyrion is a very pessimistic and broken person, but he's being given more of a role, trying to actively figure out what's going on here. And so we have some of that darker side of Tyrion, but we also have a little bit of that clever side of Tyrion, how he's going to be able to manipulate things and how he's going to be able to manipulate people. He kind of realizes something is just not right here. Young Griff is getting a better education and attention than most lords in Westeros. Why is that? What is so important about young Griff if he's just some sort of sellswords kid? It just doesn't seem to add up. And so Tyrion goes through this chapter trying to figure that out. And we see that his mind starts to work when he plays a game of Savas with Halden, the Half-Maester. And he basically puts on the line that if he wins, he wants a secret. Well, we know Tyrion eventually wins, and we find out, and he finds out a secret that we don't know yet. But there's a very cryptic ending to foreshadow what Tyrion has just found out. As at the end, they see a great turtle of the Rhine, signifying the crowning of a king. Now, us, the audience, don't know what Tyrion's talking about here. At this point in the story, it's very difficult to conclude, as us, an audience member, that this is young Griff or some sort of Targaryen. And so Tyrion realizes that. And so he won't get the payoff of that till the next chapter. But this is a really good chapter just to kind of give Tyrion something to kind of work with, right? I think one of the biggest complaints of the first 3 chapters for Tyrion is it's a lot of contemplation in those first 3 chapters for Tyrion. And yes, there are really interesting parts between Tyrion and Illyrio, but it's not like it's focused, right? There's not a lot of focus to Tyrion in those first 3 chapters. This gives him something interesting to develop, right? Us, the audience, want to know, who are all these people on board? We want to know why this cryptic ending, and that is going to help reshift Tyrion into what is he going to do with this character of young Griff? Is he going to help him? How does he feel about this? So that kind of really helps the character of Tyrion. I think, to me, it doesn't feel the same as like Tyrion and Brienne, because Brienne goes on to have one of the strongest arcs of A Feast for Crows. Whereas Tyrion, he kind of has like the first half of the book being pretty middle of the pack to then some really good chapters, and then he really falls off a cliff. But it kind of feels like that, where there's finally some like real focus for the character of Tyrion in this chapter specifically. So that gets us into chapter 16, Davos 2. So Davos 2 is a weird one, right? Because Davos has 4 chapters in this book. And the first chapter is him in Sisterton. It's really a nice catch up of what goes on after Storm of Swords. Nice reintroduction to the character, building the world out in terms of how Ned once came here during the Robert's Rebellion era. All that's really awesome. And then you have chapter 3 and 4 also being fantastic chapters dealing with Wyman Manderley and the Manderleys as a whole. This chapter is kind of that middle ground. It's Davos kind of contemplating his options. He's arriving at White Harbor, but what does he do, right? He's kind of arriving as someone that nobody knows. He's not with an envoy. He's not showing up as like this rich hand of the king. He's kind of showing up as a smuggler. And really what this chapter is trying to do is build the atmosphere and analyze White Harbor, kind of showing what's been going on here, because we haven't been here, right? The closest we kind of have been here in reality on screen is in book 1, Catelyn comes with the Manderleys to moat Kaelin, but we don't see White Harbor. We learn a little bit about the Manderleys from that chapter, but it's not really enough in my opinion. So in this chapter, we kind of figure out what's going on here. The Freys have shown up to White Harbor. It seems like the two are forming an alliance, but there's also some tragic things going on there. Like, where is Wyman's son? He's a captive? It's presumed he's a captive of the Freys. Well, okay, then how is Wyman going to support Stannis? And so it's Davos kind of rationalizing through all of these things. And it's Davos having to use his smuggling skills, learning about the situation as he goes to inns and things like that. But by the end of the chapter, he realizes either way, he has to present himself to the gates and needs to speak to Wyman. Again, it's a good chapter. It builds up the plot line going forward, and it really helps those next 2 chapters that Davos is going to have truly be great chapters. But the fallout is, not a lot really happens in this chapter. It's just kind of a basic block chapter where you're building up things to come. There's not too much to really talk about in this one. And so it's a good one, but it's not great really in any way. Number 17 is going to be Dany 3. Dany 3 is a chapter that I really think is good as well. I think Dany is a weird character in this book because, especially early on, where I am in my reread, so about 400 pages in, she's definitely like a middle of the pack POV. Like, she doesn't have any chapters so far that are like your best of the book, or any chapters that I think are like terrible or the worst of the book. She's just kind of there in the middle. She's just there. And so in this chapter, it's really focusing on if Dany will go back to Westeros. Will she go to that place that she believes is home? As she receives Xaro, I'm not sure how you say his name, from Qarth, one of the 13 from Book 2. So a nice callback to her arc in Book 2, but he comes offering 13 ships to take her home to Westeros and leave Slaver's Bay behind. And for Dany, to me, this doesn't really make sense because 13 ships is not enough for Dany to go home. You got to remember, she has a ton of Unsullied. There are people that are still with her, like Khalasar, that she has very small at this point, but still, any of the people that want to come with her to Westeros, it's a struggle, right? That's not enough ships, so it kind of is interesting in terms of, does Dany just take his ships? What does she do with them? And it's great for building the wars to come, as the Yunkish are already marching on Astapor and will continue towards her. And something that I think is very interesting, and one of the reasons I don't really understand Quentyn's plotline in this book is information like that we get here in like a couple sentences or a paragraph. We learn about what's also going on in Essos or around Slaver's Bay. And so we don't need things like Quentyn. I'm going to talk about that when we get to Quentyn 2. But I think that's important because this chapter really focuses the landscape of what is going on in the world at this time, or at least in Essos, I'll say specifically. But we see that Dany really has no leverage. She's struggling to get any of this economy going, as she wants to trade with Qarth, but again, she has nothing to trade. And Xaro tells her that. But all in all, Dany must decide what to do: stay and attempt to rule with a people that dislike her, or leave for home where she is presumably wanted, but leaving her people to be enslaved. It's a really interesting predicament that Dany's in. It's the one she's going to battle pretty much this entire first half of the book, because staying is something that she personally doesn't want. It doesn't have much of a benefit to her. She's not well loved here, but on the flip side of it, if she leaves, she abandons her people. She abandons the people around her. So she's kind of split in half. Whereas personally, what was motivating her, she wants to go reclaim the Iron Throne. She wants to go back to where her presumed home is. But her moral conscience and what is holding her back is the people she's slaved, the people that she believes she's a mother to. And so this chapter is really good because it paints that right there front and center. We're not shying away from it. It gives Dany an ultimatum as to what she's going to do. But I also find something that is interesting that George uses. George uses Viserys to impact Daenerys' thoughts all throughout this chapter, in terms of going home, in terms of what she should be doing that is to her own personal benefit, how she thinks about him and how she acts. All is very present in this chapter, and I like that George does that callback because Viserys was such an integral part of her story and why she became a Khaleesi, why she became the Mother of Dragons. All of that is vital to understanding. But in the end, she decides to stay, to the anger of Xaro, who leaves a bloody glove declaring war. Again, Dany has once again made more enemies. She now has enemies on all sides of her, things that will collapse in on itself as the book continues to go on, and it's something that still has yet to be resolved in Winds of Winter. Again, I noted that this chapter was not as good as I think her second chapter, but was still very enjoyable, had its own kind of contained story, and I really did enjoy it. And that gets us into chapter 18, which will be Jon 4. Again, this is another good chapter for Jon, as it's his last with Stannis. It's kind of the breaking of the early Jon chapters, where Jon has been a character that's kind of been divided in things taking up the time in his POVs. you know, with the Stannis stuff, with kind of other things going on with the wildling plot, with, you know, the Sam, Gilly, Aemon plot of sending them south. There's been a lot of things that have kind of struggled to focus Jon on like one thing at this time. And so here he's kind of trying to do a lot here. Because the chapter opens with the issues of food, right? Jon goes down to see their stores, see what their reserves are looking like for winter, and it's not good, right? Bowen Marsh even states this: we don't have enough food for all of Stannis's men, all of these wildlings. We just don't have the food. And Jon is basically forced to make a choice to start rationing the food. Another thing that's going to lead to why people don't respect him and or why people dislike him and are willing to kill him. But on the other side of that, you also have Jon, who's not listening to Marsh. They don't have enough food with the wildlings and Stannis here. And the problem Jon faces throughout all of this book is he's not willing to tell the people why they are doing things, right? He just does them and expects people to just go along with it. One of the things, if you want to look at if Jon is a Targaryen, that one of his ancestors did really well, is Jaehaerys would be someone that would sit down with people, hear their grievances, and explain why he thought maybe that was not the right course of action. Jon consistently in this book does not do that. And this chapter puts it on full display. He doesn't listen to Bowen Marsh, and when he does, he kind of just says a bland answer and then just leaves. So he says, yeah, we'll ration the food. But he doesn't give a, how do we fix the solution? Rationing the food will help the situation, but it's not a solve. We're still going to have the same end result. We don't have enough food. And whether Jon doesn't have a solution to that yet at all already, fine, but you still have to explain what's going on. That's where people will lose trust in you. And that's exactly what we're going to see in this book. But the second part of this chapter is almost completely on Stannis. It's about what Stannis is going to be doing in the north. Stannis is someone that realizes he cannot stay at the wall forever. The longer he does, the more he'll be forgotten about and all of that. And so he decides, okay, maybe I should march to the Dreadfort. A lot of people have been suggesting that, Arnulf Karstark being one of those. Again, we know this is actually a trap, but us as the readers don't know that at this point, but that is what is going on. And we again see that a lot of our counselors agree to this, right? Many of them, all of them are not from the north. They don't really know what the north is like, and it's a dumb plan. Think about how long the march is to the Dreadfort. They're at the very top of the north at the wall. It would take a long time to get there. They'd be extremely lucky if they even got there without being noticed. And the Dreadfort is a very strong castle. How were they supposing they were going to get in, even if it is lightly garrisoned? But also moving that far south puts you right in the crossfires of not only Ramsay's army at the time, that's this far down south, and also Roos's army coming up from Moat Cailin. And you could be thinking, okay, well, they hope the Ironborn are going to be able to hold Moat Cailin. But Stannis is smart enough to realize Moat Cailin's going to be attacked from the north and the south. It's going to fall very quickly. And so in that regard, this is a terrible plan. And so Jon disagrees, being the only one really able to step up and tell him this. It won't work. And instead, he makes a trade. He wants to keep the wildlings and tell Stannis of different men that he can get in the mountain clans. And so, more or less, we have a whole new plot. Stannis is going to head to Deepwood Motte after getting the mountain clans, and that is where Stannis will go. And this is the end of the Stannis and Jon plot. The two will not see each other in this book. They may see each other in the next book, but this is kind of the end of the Stannis plot for Jon. Now, this kind of has an interesting question, and I want to talk about this more when we get to it. But you as a reader then might be thinking, okay, where are we then going to get our Stannis POV? Davos is in White Harbor. Mel is going to be staying here, and Mel wasn't even a POV at this time anyway. There's no one that's a POV that's going to be with Stannis. So are we going to hear about these events? Are we going to see them through Theon's eyes, but it's going to be from the Ramsay camp? We're going to definitely see that, but what is going to happen there? And so you also, I think as a reader, you don't really realize, wait, who could be at Deepwood Motte? Asha. And so when you get to that chapter, it all feels like it flows perfectly well. And some people might be saying, oh, well, that's convenient. You lose one POV and you pick up another one for Stannis's camp. but I'm going to explain when we get there why it's not a plot convenience and it makes perfect sense. Where something else we're going to talk about with Quentyn is a plot convenience, and I have a lot of problems with that plot line. But I wanted to bring that up here because it is important to understand. But again, I think of another really good chapter for Jon. I think Jon so far is definitely been one of the stronger POVs of the book, and that'll get us back to Tyrion. And this is what I'm talking about, right? Like, Tyrion is a dominant POV this early in the story. We only talk about 3 POVs after Tyrion's, and we're already back to him with Tyrion 5. But Tyrion 5 is definitely one of my favorite chapters, especially of the early part of this book, as again, it's Tyrion just in his element, right? This is one of my favorite chapters from Tyrion this early in the book, as they're continuing their journey getting past the sorrows. But more importantly, we get the reveal of who is in the party. Well, some of them anyway. That young Griff is Aegon Targaryen, the child of Rhaegar and Elia, who is supposedly killed at the end of Rhaegar's rebellion. Now, we still don't know if this is actually true, but either way, this is a massive shakeup to the entire story. And that's regardless of if he even is a Targaryen. Him being perceived as a Targaryen is huge. If he's a Blackfire, that has huge implications on the story. And so this chapter takes this Tyrion storyline that's kind of been somewhat muddied and really struggling to get going, and it just has an explosion, and you're sitting here going, whoa. But then not only that, but we also get, this is Jon Connington, one of the Hands of the King that had been exiled to Essos after his loss at the Battle of the Bells. A lot of interesting characters are just revealed at this part of the book for Tyrion 5. And when you look back on it and you realize what is to come next, you understand why this had to happen so quickly, why we got so many Tyrion chapters. And I think you can make the argument that maybe Tyrion 1 and Tyrion 2 could have been combined into one chapter. Maybe it would have helped the flow of this book, not having 5 Tyrion chapters within the first 19. But you understand going forward why there were so many, because we need that Jon Con plot to get rolling. We talk about Winds of Winter, how there's just so many different plots and so much stuff that George needs to get through. Well, think about if this plot had taken even longer, right? Now, I would also argue that the way you could have fixed this is you would have given Tyrion less chapters going forward and given more to Jon Con. But, you know, that we'll get to that as we go later on with Tyrion's arc. But right after we get this huge reveal, Tyrion also reveals himself to the party. So no longer is Tyrion really playing the role of being this bastard type. He is now revealed that he is Tyrion Lannister. At this, though, they are attacked by stone men. And this scene just plays out very horrifyingly. Like, these stone men could get you infected just by touching your skin. Us, the audience, have no idea what is going to happen here. Could this get young Griff killed, or Jon Connington killed, or any of our companions killed? And we end up seeing Tyrion actually pushing young Griff out of the way so that he can get this stone man off of him. It shows that Tyrion does have some semblance of a good morality. Now, was this done because Tyrion was trying to get in good with young Griff? Possibly, but I would go away from that idea, given the fact that Tyrion kind of acts just out of instinct. He does the same thing with Catelyn Stark. It seems almost the same, right? Tyrion has no real reason to help either young Griff or Catelyn, but he does so. He acts. And the chapter ends with Tyrion falling and drowning. And the chapter ends with a really interesting moment, because it's like, it's kind of alluding that Tyrion is going to die, but I think us, the audience, we know he's not going to die. Tyrion is not going to die by drowning in a river. It's just not going to happen. But the implications here are much more dire. Tyrion's being dragged down. Is Tyrion going to get infected with grayscale? Could it happen? What could happen because of this dire moment? Tyrion going completely into this river filled with the stone men, possibly infected and or cursed. There's a lot there. And so this chapter does a great job in terms of building the tension, in terms of having a huge plot twist that changes up the entire story, and to me is by far Tyrion's best chapter I think probably in this book. When I wrote it down, I said best so far of my notes and of these first two parts. But honestly, reflecting on Tyrion in this book, this is probably his best chapter within the entire book. And that will get us into Davos 3. Now, Davos 3, what can I say about this? It's not Davos's best chapter of the book, but it's a good one. Because this chapter, I think, of a lot of the chapters that are in this book, it does the best to immerse you. It almost puts you in the story, right? Because we as the audience like the Starks. We know what happened at the Red Wedding. We are kind of like the overlooker of the world. We know all the information. But when you go into this chapter and you see Davos has become more or less a prisoner, it's a luxury prisoner. Like, he's getting a nice cell. It's very similar to like Sansa in book 1 after Ned's coup. Like, she has her own apartments and all that, but she's not really able to go anywhere, right? That's kind of where Davos is right now. And so he's awaiting audience with the Manderleys. And we see him interact with Wyman's court, and specifically the Freys. And what is great here is George makes us feel like we are in this meeting. We, the audience, are playing the role of Wyla Manderley. Because Wyla Manderley is the one that's like, no, we shouldn't be, going with these Freys. This is wrong. The Freys suck. They killed Robb, our king. We should help Stannis. That's us as the audience, right? We know that. Like, that's what they should be doing. And we're sitting here going, why don't they do this? Why is Wyman Manderley believing the Freys? But George has already given us all those answers. He gave those answers to us in the last chapter, which is why this chapter flows so well. We already know all the information. We know that Davos is doomed. There's still that hope in us. There's still that Wyla Manderley, that feeling of just, we can't do anything. The story is going to continue with or without us. And that's what the beauty of this chapter. It puts us in the minds of these characters. But we see how the Freys manipulate this game. They say the Starks were in the wrong, and Wyman seems to agree with their reasoning, as Robb broke this vow to marry a Frey girl. He also turns into this wolf and starts attacking them during the wedding, and so do the Stark men, painting the Starks as the bad guys. The arrogance of the Freys in this moment. But in reality, when you think about it, nobody was there, so nobody exactly knows what happens. Again, the Freys can kind of spread this lie, but we all know this is bullshit at the same time. But it all sets up perfectly to the reveal we're going to get in the next chapter, because all this makes sense. Wyman is stuck in this situation where his son is a hostage. The Freys have men here in White Harbor to make sure that he is loyal. He has to play this game, right? He can't straight out say that, oh yeah, I'm going to back Davos. The Freys suck. He has to play this game. And so we come to the end of this chapter, and Davos loses the argument and is sentenced to death, which again lines up exactly with what we know happens in Feast for Crows. In Feast for Crows, in one of Cersei's middle chapters, we learn that yes, Davos is killed at White Harbor. And that's what prompts the Freys to release Wyman's son. Now, with this being said, though, we're left with the conclusion of what is to happen with Davos. We don't see him die on screen in this chapter. He's just being arrested, but it seems pretty bleak, right? Like, what can Wyman Manderley really do? He seems publicly to be backing the Freys. He has a knife to his back. There's not a lot he can really do. And it continues to make Davos one of my favorite POVs of this book. And that concludes it. Again, that is one of the best chapters of this early part of the book. I think I had it in my top 5, if I'm not mistaken. As of right now, it's not in my top 5, but it's number 6, but it is one of the best of this book by far. We talked about, firstly, Theon 1 or Reek 1 in this retrospective, but now we're with Theon 2. And again, this is a really good chapter for Theon. It kind of builds, it takes everything that was great about the first chapter and just heightens it. It makes it more plot relevant. It gives us more time to expand Theon's logic and how he is as a person. How is his mental health at this time? Very awful at this time. we see that Theon is being cleaned up for his role to play his past self, with the goal of taking Moat Cailin, still occupy the Ironborn. Now, what does this setup already do? It puts us in the mind of Reek trying to play his former self. So it's again him having that split personality of his younger self, of reflecting on his actions, things that he did, the mistakes he may have made, or the people that he used to care about. But it also takes that part of it. It takes the Stark side of him, and it also puts that in direct conflict with his Ironborn side as well, as he also is having to play the role of being the prince of the Ironborn, taking control of them and making them surrender, offering them generous terms. It's a really great chapter because it takes all these things that are pivotal to this character this moment and puts it right there. But the beauty comes from, I think, the psychological torture that Theon has gone through. Even in this situation where Theon could try and run, he could get himself killed, let the Ironborn kill him, do any of these things to escape what he's going through, he's still scared. He is someone that I think most people are scared of what comes after death. Right? Is there some sort of afterlife? Is there nothing? That's what Theon could be feeling, that, you know, even though all this torture is horrible, you know, that is also another thing, is the fear of the unknown. And Theon subconsciously wants to die, but at the same time, he doesn't do it. And so you have a lot of things that are very compelling for the character of Theon, but that kind of gets Theon to remembering, you know, the last time coming here with Robb and the choices that he made. Again, he recounts basically the Catelyn chapter of coming to Moat Cailin, of where all they were situated in these towers and all the 20,000 men going south. But at the same time, we see a bit of Theon come back as he takes control in Moat Cailin and convinces them to leave the castle. Unfortunately for those men, they are killed, but Theon gets a reward. And this again shows the power dynamic of how low Theon is. Even when faced with being able to get a reward, all Theon asks for is wine. And what does Theon get promoted to? Not to a normal human, but to a dog. We see the mental games Ramsay is playing, keeping Theon as this pet that is completely damaged. But we end the chapter meeting Roose Bolton and the Freys. But he also realizes that the Arya that they have brought with them is not actually Arya, which us, the audience, already knew. This isn't really like this big twist for us, the viewer, of us, the reader, but it's a really cool twist for Theon, because we're going to put, again, something that connects Theon to his past. We're going to connect him with Jane Poole, someone that he would have known. And so that's interesting, but it also unravels that, well, we already knew that the Boltons were planning to marry a fake Arya. And that gets us into chapter 22, Jon 5. And chapter 5, just like I talked about chapter 4, it's kind of the end of Jon's early book arc. It's a chapter mainly used to refocus Jon's plot at this time. We're going to see Jon as he tries to recruit wildlings into the Watch. Not exactly into the Watch, it's more like defending the wall. They don't have to say the vows or wear a black cloak or any of those things, but he's trying to get the wildlings to help him and help the Watch, but he's also trying to give them food and all of these things. So we see Jon traveling to Molestown. And again, what is the focus of Jon's story going to be going forward? It's going to be integrating the wildlings into the Watch. But what he does is he doesn't do anything. He doesn't explain to the people why this is a necessity. Us, the viewers, are inside Jon's head. We know why this is a necessity and needs to happen, but others do not. And again, this is not a very long chapter for Jon. It doesn't have a lot in here that really needs to be discussed, but I find this chapter good for exploring why Jon is killed. Again, it's not really explaining or expanding on his reasoning to Marsh or the Watch into why they are allowing the wildlings to help. Think about what Jon is asking. Jon is asking for not only wildlings to be part of the wall, but women. Well, there's a big reason as to why the Watch doesn't allow women and why that you're not allowed to take a wife or anything like that, because it's going to shift your loyalties. And so it puts that to the test. Should there be these wildling women on the wall trying to defend it? Should there be wildlings and Night's Watchmen together? Who knows? They can't really trust each other, and an army that can't trust one another isn't really an army. So you're putting two groups of people together and you're just mashing them together. You're not trying to let each side understand why this is necessary. You're just kind of mashing two brick walls together and hoping they mix. It's just not the best way of going about things. But again, really what I think George wanted to do with this chapter is, again, starting that process of integrating the wildlings into the wall, but also showing Jon's lack of communication to be crucial to his arc. Now, this gets us to a very conflicting chapter for me. Tyrion 6. It's a really, really weird one because the first half I love. I love the first half of Tyrion waking up from being saved by Griff and all that comes with that. But I really enjoy what we get between young Griff and Tyrion because it's Tyrion being at his best, you know, manipulating people, talking to people, and getting them to do what he wants them to do. And so we see young Griff and Tyrion playing Savas, and Tyrion gives young Griff some very interesting lessons and things that are going to be crucial going forward with the story. He tells young Griff that he should go to Westeros. Again, going to Westeros is very beneficial. The realm is not united at the time. Cersei is basically in control. We see how that worked out in Feast for Crows, so we know Tyrion is right. The North is in open rebellion. The Riverlands are all screwed up at this time. The Westerlands' power has been completely weakened during this time period. The Dornish are ripe for rebellion. We know that to also be true. So Tyrion says, take this Golden Company army and go to Westeros. And we also see another rationale that Tyrion uses to justify this. If he goes to Dany, he's going to look like a beggar. He's going to be looking like someone that is asking for her hand. They're not going to meet on equal terms. It's going to be kind of like the way Quentyn goes about asking for Dany. And so we see a lot of this play out. But what we end up seeing is that Tyrion, during this Savas game, was also lying to him, trying to get young Griff to do things like keeping his dragon away from his king so that he can beat him in this game. That's what ends up happening. We see that Tyrion's point is driven home. Trust no one, because that's how Tyrion thinks. He doesn't trust anyone. He is a very pessimistic person. And I don't really think that's the outlook you should have in the world. I think you can trust certain people. You just need to be understanding of who you can trust and who you cannot trust. And so Tyrion gets the better of young Griff, and young Griff has a bit of that Targaryen fieriness to him, something that people have speculated on in the future of how young Griff is going to be. Young Griff basically rage quits. He knocks the board and the pieces to the side. He forces Tyrion to clean them up, very similar to the way Joffrey has like Tyrion pick up his goblet during the Purple Wedding. And all of this is very interesting because it paints a lot of what we could see between the characters of young Griff and Tyrion going forward. But the second half is where you get a little not so good in this chapter, because it takes place in a town where they are to get some information on the political climate going on with the war in Meereen. But more importantly, we see Tyrion's dark side as he pays for sex and even asks for the woman to kill him, as he is suicidal. And there's some really dark things that go on here in terms of really bad alcoholism, in terms of Tyrion, raping this girl, in terms of just Tyrion being an awful human being. And eventually, why I say this is a mixed bag chapter, not only for those bad things that we see from Tyrion, but he is eventually captured by Jorah, starting probably the worst plotline of the book. I think it's like this plotline plus Quentyn's plotline are probably the worst two of this book. I personally cannot think of a single chapter I like of Tyrion's after this moment. And so it is that point. And another thing I find that's kind of a big problem I think George has in this book specifically, it just seems like a really big plot convenience. Like, really, out of every single brothel that Tyrion could go to, he ends up going to the one with Jorah in it. And it's not one of those things where you can point to, oh, well, in book 1, the same thing happens with Tyrion and Catelyn. It's like, no, because both were heading towards the Crossroad Inn, and so it made sense. It's a logical hub of where things would happen and where you would go either to the west, the east, the north, or the south. This, it just feels very random. It feels like very convenient. And again, that's not bad to have every once in a while. That's not to say conveniences are a bad thing, but it's when you have a lot of them, that's when you start to like look at these and go, I don't know if that was the best point here. And I think the difficult part George has here is George had to come to an idea where how does Tyrion now get away from the young Griff group to go to Daenerys? That's the issue. And I think, how would you have willingly gotten Tyrion away from them? That could have been something difficult. Now, what you could have explored, and this could be something interesting that would have, I think, worked a lot better, is if we would have seen Tyrion actually willingly leave young Griff, willingly leave our party and try to search for Tysha. One of the big things to see throughout this entire plot line is Tyrion looking for her. Where do whores go? And he's not going to be able to really find that with Dany and young Griff. So you could have his personal motivations kind of getting through in terms of finding love again. So that would have been something where maybe he breaks off from their party. And then maybe while he's out at these docks, maybe we have like this chapter, the second half of this chapter is just him kind of wandering around in the city, and eventually he's spotted. That way it feels much more natural in terms of like people would have known that there was a dwarf going around, and then maybe Jorah would have heard this and found him. It just doesn't feel as natural in terms of just Jorah being in the same brothel as Tyrion at the same time. A complete coincidence. It just doesn't really feel right to me, but I get why George did it. I just think it could have been executed a bit better in my opinion. That gets us into chapter 24, Dany 4. Again, another chapter that has kind of its strengths and its weaknesses. On one hand, I really like the opening of this chapter with the Green Grace and Dany. It oozes suspicion. Something is not really right here. The Green Grace, once again, is talking down to Dany, kind of putting her in her place, kind of knowing information that it seems very suspicious that she already knows before Daenerys even tells her. But not only that, but we also have reflections of the past. Dany trusting older women. Very similar to Miri. It's very apparent, given that I just got done doing my review of the Miri Mazdur chapter where she meets Dany, it almost feels so similar here. But one of the things that comes out of this conversation is that the Green Grace suggests the only way to fix this situation is for her to marry someone with old Giscari blood, someone that the Marinese people can get behind. And so that leads to the Hisdar plot. But before we get there, I want to talk about another interesting moral question that is brought up here. The Green Grace kind of brings up they have hostages. Why don't they kill them? Like, why doesn't Dany kill the hostages? When there are people dying, free men are dying, or people are dying, but she's not using these hostages. And it's a part of, again, Dany is someone that is not a bad person. She tries to be a good person, and she likes a lot of these people. A lot of these young children that she's being given as hostages, she's starting to enjoy them. And that's the issue, because it comes back to this idea that Ned talks about, that Jon and Robb try to kind of go through with. Don't be friends of people that are your subordinates. You may have to kill them one day or send them off to be killed. Especially in the case of Theon. Ned never got close to Theon because Ned knew he might one day have to kill Theon. That's something that Dany doesn't do, and that's some advice that she probably sorely needs. I like all that. But on the flip side, I find the romance side of this chapter, which is the back half, to just be kind of boring, kind of repetitive. It's just Dany has so many love interests over the entirety of the series. She also is someone that consistently thinks about Dario early on in this book. It just gets so repetitive. So we see again Dany it's Dany setting up the terms of a marriage with Hisdar. If he can keep the peace and no killings happen for 90 days, she will marry him. Albeit she doesn't really like him that much, and even kisses him to see if there's any type of, thing there. There isn't really. And so Dany just sees it kind of as a win-win type scenario. If he can give the peace for 90 days, well, at least she saved her people, and it shows that there can be some stability. But on the other side of it, if, again, he doesn't, it just kind of forestalls stuff like the marriage for now. And then we get to see Dario, and Dario comes back, and Dany's real excited. She's getting all dressed up, and then she just knows she can't be with him. You know, he's a sellsword, and so part of this angers her, but it also angers her because Daario tries to give her advice, telling her to be a dragon, telling her to strike at her enemies, killing the masters, and that's not who Dany is at this point. Dany is someone that's not morally bad. She tries to be a good person, and so she struggles with that. It's something that the Marinese plot is pushing her further and further to the edge of how does she again get these people to respect her, get these people to stop killing each other and bring order to Meereen. How does she do that? And that's something she struggles with a lot. So there are bits and pieces of this chapter I really love. There's bits and pieces of this chapter I really dislike. And that's kind of where I am with Dany at times in this book. But again, I don't think it's a bad chapter at all, but I do think out of the Dany chapter so far, probably her weakest. But just as I say that, this is probably my least favorite Dany chapter, George, once again, seems to intersplice his chapters perfectly. And I want to just kind of look at the next 3 chapters as they are the last 3 we're going to be doing in this retrospective for this part. We have a Dany chapter that's not so good, followed by a Jon Con chapter, his first one of the best chapters of the book, very highly rated for me and is my favorite of the first 27. We then get a Quentyn chapter, one of the worst chapters of the book, the second worst for me at this point, and then we're followed up by another banger in an Asha chapter. It really does show that I feel like George knows kind of his weaker chapters, and he follows them up with great chapters to kind of hide them a little bit in his book, and so I really love that because that's been a consistent thing that I've seen in both Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons in this book. So Jon Con 1 is a chapter that I remember when I first started reading this book, did not know we were going to get this POV. I did not know that we were going to have this, but looking back, it makes sense, right? You can't really just introduce the young Griff plot line and then Tyrion leaves and then just have no plot point here or no POV here. And so Jon Connington is the perfect POV because he reminds you so much of Ned. He is someone that reflects on the decisions he's made in the past. He is someone that's a very complex character that has strengths and weaknesses. And we get a look into the history of the Battle of the Bells. But we see that Jon Con is someone that is highly untrusting of some of the people below him. As again, Tyrion has been lost. Something that would have been a very valuable piece, being that he is Tyrion Lannister and he was lost. But we see Jon Con and co. heading to the Golden Company's camp. We get to learn on their history and customs, which is always fun to reread given the context of the Dunk and Egg novellas and what goes on there. It's just a really awesome chapter that provides a lot of world building to the lore of the Blackfire rebellions and Bittersteel and the Golden Company as a whole, how they operate. Really fantastic chapter that I love. We see the military leadership and how it's changed from, I believe it's Blackheart to now Harry Strickland. And I really love that because this is kind of the reveal of young Griff, where young Griff comes out looking like a prince. He's not just this, you know, knight squire or sellsword squire. He's now looking more like a Targaryen. He's wearing rubies, fine clothing. And we see young Griff kind of reveal himself to the Golden Company. Now, what I find is interesting here is that the Golden Company are quite frustrated with the situation going on. There's been all these different type of plans. First, it was Viserys. Then it was Daenerys was supposed to be, they were supposed to back Daenerys, but then all those plans went awry. And now we're here with young Griff. And young Griff steps up. He takes this chance, this thing that we haven't seen him do, and he really basically takes Tyrion's advice and uses it. He tells them, screw Daenerys, screw trying to get to Meereen, because that's insanely difficult. We've seen that with Quentyn's chapter. Let's go to Westeros. It's ripe for conquest. And at this, the Golden Company realize they have a new leader. They realize is to be their king and to lead them back home. Again, this is by far my favorite chapter of the first 27. I am a big sucker for the Blackfire lore at this time. I love young Griff. He's one of my favorite characters going into the next book. I'll give you guys a bit of a spoiler for my other series going on right now, my top 100 characters of A Song of Ice and Fire. Young Griff is unfortunately not on that list just because we haven't gotten a lot with the character, but I'm really looking forward to getting more of this character personally. But yeah, it's just this awesome chapter. It feels a lot like, for instance, Robb Stark's King of the North chapter, where it's like Robb coming into his own. Now, it's very different because Robb in that is not really declaring himself as king. That's his bannerman. But here it's young Griff proving his worth and them kind of making him their king. It's one of those things. It feels very similar. And so I love everything this chapter does. And it's very vital that it's placed here, because then we get Quentyn 2. And I'm going to have a fairly big rant here about Quentyn's character so far. And that gets us to Quentyn 2. So Quentyn 2 is a chapter that it's slightly better than the first one, which isn't saying much. If you guys remember, my rant for Quentyn 1 was a chapter that was unneeded, didn't make really much sense for this plotline to even exist. That didn't change in this chapter. Again, the only reason this chapter is more interesting is because we get more of like the tattered prince, and we also get like some battle stuff with Astapor. But what do we really get out of this chapter? It's a somewhat long chapter. It's a chapter in which we learn that Astapor has fallen, and some of the stuff that we already learned with Daenerys' chapter in terms of Yunkai and Astapor. It just doesn't matter. I mean, nothing in this chapter really adds anything to the story. And this is why I think one of my biggest complaints with the early start of this book, very similar to Sam in Feast for Crows, Quentyn didn't need to be introduced in terms of a POV if you wanted to until he meets Daenerys. He just doesn't. Because once then he actually gets to Meereen, then you can kind of explore his character. The only thing that I can see as to why George put this character and gave him more POVs is because he dies at the end. And so you want him to be more of a character we like, so it hits harder, and give him more time to develop. But the problem becomes I find the character to be, every time he's a chapter, he slows down the pace. It comes down all the way down to a crawl. And this chapter just does not, and this character doesn't really have much going for him. Like, there's not much in terms of defining an actual character. Like, the best we've got is he feels like he maybe is not worthy of Daenerys. He's not the most attractive guy. And maybe some stuff in terms of like honor, right? Breaking oaths. Like, that's something that could be interesting to explore in this chapter. And it's one of the only things I find interesting in this chapter. But like, why is this character here? He's not interesting. There's no reason to have this character. It's very similar, in my opinion, to like Tyrion later on, where it's like, we just don't need like 9 chapters or whatever it is of just Tyrion being a slave and all of that. It just, you don't need it. And so I'm not going to really explain this chapter too much, but more or less what we get is we see Quentyn with the wind blown, how they've taken part in this battle with Astapor, and it was kind of a slaughter. It wasn't really even a fight. All of this we kind of already know from Dany's POVs later on anyway. So like, doesn't matter. This information doesn't really matter to me. We also then see that the group is trying to get out of the windblown company. Whatever. I mean, it introduces some interesting conflicts of having to break oaths and vows, which are more sacred, especially to higher born people in Westeros, which is kind of interesting, but they don't dwell on it very long. And also, they give them a cop-out. They give our main, like, 3 Dornish George gives our main 3 Dornish, like, a point where they have to make a decision. You know, if you go back to book 1, Aemon with Jon, it comes to every point in someone's life where they have to make a huge decision. Here is that decision, you would think, but then the story gives them a cop-out. The story goes, oh yeah, the Tattered Prince goes, yeah, you guys are gonna basically start scouting, and then we want you to basically go over to either the Second Sons or the Stormcloaks, and then more or less be an in with Daenerys. And you're sitting here and you're going, how convenient can we get? Like, oh wow, the main conflict of our character's story is instantly solved. Not because of anything they did, but because the Tattered Prince wants them to do it. And I can understand the Tattered Prince's logic. It's not impossible, right? It's not like not plausible at all. I understand his rationale. But at the same time, for it to be out of like this group, I think it's like 1,000 or 2,000 men, Quentyn and the Dornish as new recruits are sent to do this mission. Kind of questionable. I know it's because they speak the common tongue, but like, okay. It just seems too convenient. That's what I've been talking about. There's been a couple conveniences here and there throughout this first part of the story, and this is the worst one because it makes you kind of stretch what I would believe the Tattered Prince would do. It makes me question, why did we even have this whole chapter set up of, oh, you know, will we break our vows? Is that dishonorable? When are we going to break away from this? Could be a huge danger to our lives. And then the chapter just resolves the conflict for them. They didn't do anything to earn it. And so I don't like this chapter. I don't like Quentyn as a character. The story is very bland for the character. I don't know what else to say. This just isn't a very good chapter, and it's down there with Quentyn 1. At least this one has a bit more stakes to it. There's more interesting concepts brought up. It just doesn't go anywhere. And so I just did all of that ranting, right? And what does George come back and give us? He gives us Asha 1, a chapter that I have as my number 4 ranked chapter of the first 27 chapters. And it's just a fantastic chapter. We get brought back into the character of Asha, and it's really awesome because you think about Feast for Crows. Asha kind of just disappears off the face of the earth. You know, after the King's Moot, we get, I think it's one more Victarion chapter after the King's Moot, and that's it, right? We don't get a lot of what happens after. And so you almost forget about Asha. And then what it's great is because this is what an actual plot line looks like. Because where I just talked about there was a convenience with the Quentyn stuff, you might be thinking, oh, well, it's very convenient that Asha becomes the new POV for Stannis. But it's not convenient at all. Asha makes logical sense, would go to Deepwood Mott. She has nowhere that's safe that she can stay in the Iron Islands. So what does she do? She could go to Deepwood Mott. She could maybe flee and go into kind of like an exile type situation, go become a merchant or a pirate. But she goes to Deepwood Mott. And that makes, I think, a lot of sense for her. It's something that she's taken over. She can maybe kind of feel some sort of safety there for now. That'll make sense. Stannis would take Deepwood Mott because A, it's closer to the wall, and 2, it gains him leverage to say he's the one taking out the Ironborn. As well, it's close to where he is. So it all adds up into why this occurs in terms of storytelling. And so let's look at the actual chapter, the content that we get here, and how good it is as well. So the only thing I will say that kind of brings this PO down for me is that we get a very extended sex scene with Carl the Maid and Asha, to the point where I'm just like, I get that Asha had sex, but do we really need almost like 2 pages worth of this? Like, it feels like you're reading like a, I don't know what you would call like a sex novel, or like, I don't know what you would call it, but it's basically how it plays out in the 2 pages it's on, more or less. And so I understand why it's necessary for George to show that Asha is having sex. You can just do it in a better way. Just like be like, oh yeah, they started doing it, and then that's it. Cut it off right there. We don't need to hear the whole thing. But the point of what George is trying to do with it is showing that Asha feels all the pressures of the world are slowly boxing her in. She sees her life will be ending soon, as either the Northmen will come for her, or if she leaves, the Ironborn coming for her in Euron. She sees her life is coming to a close. And so just for these few, minutes or whatever long they're having sex, she's taken out of that. She's able to, have a life and enjoy things going on. And so it's a point of that. It's trying to take away some of that stress on Asha. Outside of that, this chapter is pretty perfect. We see Asha trying to figure out what to do as she has fled the King's Moot for Deepwood Mott. Should she flee or fight? And we see Stannis, along with the Northmen, attack her in the middle of the night as they try to sneak into the castle to open the gates. But Asha has faced the decision. She can either flee back to her boats or try to fight them at Deepwood Mott. And her rationale is pretty sound. When she tried to take Deepwood Mott, the castle didn't help them. It wasn't that defensible. She was able to take it pretty easily. And so she comes to the same conclusion. She must flee to her boats. The only issue is the Northmen know these forests better than she does. And in the night, they are caught up once again by Stannis and the Northmen. And Asha fights for a while, being able to kill many men along with some of her companions. But eventually, she is caught. And she sees as the banner of Stannis comes upon them, and leaving Asha to an interesting fate. Is Asha going to die or be captured? I think for any reader, they know she's going to be captured because we need a POV for Stannis, but it makes sense as to why she would just be captured, as Asha is a very valuable hostage. And that ends Asha 1 for A Dance with Dragons. So I personally love this last chapter we did in this part, but that is going to be the end of part 2. Thank you guys all for watching. I hope you guys all enjoyed. Subscribe if you enjoyed the video, if you got this far. These videos do take a lot of time to do, and I hope you guys all enjoyed them. Bye guys.